In 1870, Truman was lost in Yellowstone with only 2 knives and a pair of opera glasses. He was slowly starving to death. As winter set in, his only food, the roots of thistles. Then, ghostly guides appeared to show him the way home. The pioneers of outlaw country, cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws, the businessmen and women, will all help shape Wyoming. Here are their stories. The Ghostly Guides of Yellowstone.
High above Truman Everts' head soared the jagged rocks of the Madison Mountain. It was 1870, and the tax collector had been lost in the remote, unexplored Yellowstone region for weeks. During his ordeal, Truman had been burned by hot springs, tormented by wild animals, had set the forest on fire, and was now slowly starving to death, having eaten the last of his thistle roots. Truman was determined to get home. His daughter needed him, and the quickest route back to her, in his fevered mind, was over the mountain. After struggling over rugged hills, through thickets and dense forest, Truman had finally reached the mountain, and now thousands of feet of rock rose before him. However, before Truman started searching for a passage through this mountain, a clear voice spoke to him and called him a fool. Welcome to Pioneers of Outlaw Country, where we explore the stories of Wyoming's past. I am your host, Jackie Dorothy, and for this season, we have been exploring Wyoming's haunted history. Today, we are traveling back in time to 1870, when a lost soul claims that he was guided to his rescue by ghostly companions. This episode is brought to you by Rooted in Legacy, helping you preserve your family stories and the legends that shape who we are. Book your free discovery call at legendrockmedia.com and let's chat. Truman Everts had been living for several years in Montana Territory as the first federal tax assessor in the region. He had heard fantastical stories about the greater Yellowstone region, and so eagerly joined a 1870 expedition which was setting out that August to explore the region. Truman felt the hardships of a month on horseback through unexplored territory would be worth the novelty of seeing the grand scenery he had heard so much about. Several days into the trip, the expedition pushed through the dense growth and fallen timber of the pine forest with difficulty. Truman found a passage through the forest and took off alone. He soon strayed out of sight and hearing of his comrades, but wasn't concerned since separations like this had frequently occurred. He was riding along with his pack horse. Unfortunately, Truman had bad eyesight and was not used to being in the wilderness, especially alone. He spurred his saddle horse forward, accidentally gaining speed as he took off, unaware he was going in the wrong direction. He was still not alarmed as darkness fell and he made a camp for the night. He had picketed his horse, built a fire, and soon fell asleep. The next morning, he was up at dawn and started off in what he supposed was the direction of the lake. He was soon hopelessly lost, and when he dismounted to examine the trail with his poor eyesight, his horse was frightened and ran off. Truman turned around in time to see the horse disappearing at full speed among the trees. His blankets, gun, pistols, fishing tackle, matches, everything except the clothing on his person, a couple of knives, and a small opera glass were attached to that saddle. Instead of continuing to look for his companions, Truman chased after his horse for half a day. After failing to recover the horse and his supplies, alarm took the place of anxiety at the prospect of another night alone in the wilderness, and this time without food or fire. Truman cheered himself up by imagining how everyone would laugh at his adventure, and it would be an amusing story to share with his daughter when he was back home. After another half a day of searching, Truman resigned himself to another night alone. He described himself as naturally timid in the night, and his own imagination frightened him. The wind sighed mournfully through the pines. The forest seemed alive with the screeching of night birds, the angry barking of coyotes, and the prolonged, dismal howl of the gray wolf. These sounds, which Truman was familiar with by their constant occurrence throughout the trip, were now full of terror and drove slumber from his eyelids. The next day, there was no sign of his companions, and the reality of his situation hit Truman. He had no food or fire. He was alone in an unexplored wilderness, 150 miles from the nearest human abode, surrounded by wild beasts and famishing with hunger. Truman knew this was no time for despondency. He pressed on, surprised that instead of hunger, he just felt weak. Exhaustion pulled on him as he pushed himself through thickets and scrambled over logs. Truman's thoughts tormented him, but he pushed them away and focused on survival. At midday, he reached a lake and was stunned by the beauty that surrounded him, from the vapor of the numerous hot springs to the sparkling jet of a single geyser. Swans, otters, minks, and beaver all swam before him, and he was amused by their antics. Deer, elk, and mountain sheep stared at him, manifesting more surprise than fear at his presence among them. He recognized the mountain which overshadowed the scene as the landmark which a few days before had received from General Washburn the name of Mount Everts. And as it was associated with some of the most agreeable and terrible incidents of his exile, he finally felt that he had both a discoverer's right and that of a survivor's to have the mountain named after himself. Truman believed he had discovered the source of the great southern tributary of the Columbia and gave it the name of Bessie Lake, after his beloved daughter. While enjoying the moment, Truman suddenly grew excited. During these first 2 days, he had been fearful of meeting with Indians, but now there was nothing he more desired as to fall in with a lodge of Bannocks or Crows. He figured that they would spare his life for the reward they would receive, and so was now delighted when he saw a large canoe carrying a single oarsman crossing the lake. It was rapidly approaching the shore where Truman had been seated. With hurried steps, he paced the beach to meet it, all his energy stimulated by the assurance it gave of food, safety, and restoration to friends. As Truman drew near, the canoe turned towards the shore, and oh, bitter disappointment! The object which his eager fancy had transformed into an angel of relief stalked from the water. It was an enormous pelican who flapped its dragon wings as if in mockery of his sorrow and flew to a solitary point farther up the lake. This little incident quite unmanned Truman. The transition from joy to grief brought with it a terrible consciousness of the horrors of his condition. But night was fast approaching, and darkness would come with it. While looking for a spot where he might repose in safety, his attention was attracted to a small green plant that was a striking contrast with the deep pine foliage. Truman pulled it up by the root, which was long and tapering, not unlike a radish. It was a thistle. He tasted it. It was palatable and nutritious. Truman's first meal in 4 days was made on thistle roots. Eureka! He had found food. No optical illusion deceived him this time, and he could subsist until he rejoined his companions. Overjoyed at this discovery, with hunger allayed, Truman stretched himself under a tree and fell asleep. It was still night when he was suddenly awakened by a loud, shrill scream, like that of a human being in distress. There was no mistaking that fearful voice. Truman had been deceived by and answered it a dozen times while threading through the forest, with the belief that it was a friendly signal. It was the screech of a mountain lion, so alarmingly near as to cause every nerve to thrill with terror. Truman acted immediately and swung himself up into the tree. Scrambling hurriedly from limb to limb, he was soon as near the top as safety would permit. The savage beast was snuffing and growling below, apparently on the very spot he had just abandoned. Truman answered every growl with a responsive scream. Terrified at the pawing of the beast, Truman increased his voice to its utmost volume, broke branches from the limbs, and in the grip of terror madly hurled them at the howls below. Failing to alarm the animal, which now began to make a circuit of the tree, Truman shook the slender pine until every limb rustled with the motion. All in vain. The mountain lion pursued his walk around the tree, lashing the ground with his tail and prolonging his howlings almost to a roar. It was too dark to see, but the movements of the lion kept Truman aware of its position. Whenever he heard it on one side of the tree, he speedily changed to the opposite, an exercise which in his weakened state he could only have performed under the impulse of terror. Clasping the trunk of the tree with both arms, Truman changed tactics and sat perfectly still. The lion, who had been occasionally snuffing and pausing between filling the forest with the echo of his howlings, suddenly imitated Truman's example. This silence was more terrible, if possible, than the clatter and crash of his movements through the brushwood. For now Truman did not know from what direction to expect his attack. Finally, the mountain lion gave a spring into the thicket and ran screaming into the forest. Weakened from the attack, Truman nearly fell from the tree, and, as incredible as it seemed, fell asleep in the very spot the mountain lion had just been. The next morning, Truman did not have much time to think of how close he came to being cat food, for there was a noticeable change to the weather. A dreary storm of mingled snow and rain had arrived. His torn clothing did not offer much protection against the wind, which had increased to a gale. Truman could find no better shelter than the spreading branches of a spruce tree, under which, covered with earth and branches, he lay for the next 2 days. The storm raged with unabated violence. While thus exposed and suffering from cold and hunger, a little bird, not larger than a snowbird, hopped within his reach. Truman instantly seized and killed it, and plucking its feathers, ate it raw. It was a delicious meal for a half-starved man. Taking advantage of a lull in the elements, on the morning of the third day, Truman rose early and started in the direction of a large group of hot springs which were steaming under the shadow of Mount Everts, his namesake. The distance he traveled could not have been less than 10 miles. Long before he reached the wonderful cluster of natural cauldrons, the storm had recommenced. Chilled through, with his clothing truly saturated, Truman lay down under a tree upon the heated incrustation until completely warmed. His heels and the sides of his feet were frozen. Truman ate thistle roots as his limbs slowly warmed up, and then built a shelter over the hot crust with pine branches. Thistles were abundant. In convenient proximity to his small abode was also a small, round, boiling spring, which he called his dinner pot, and in this, from time to time, he cooked his roots. This establishment he occupied for 7 days, the first 3 of which were darkened by one of the most fierce storms he had ever seen. The vapor which supplied him with warmth saturated his clothing with its condensations. He was enveloped in a perpetual steam bath. At first, this was barely preferable to the storm, but he soon became accustomed to it, and before he left, though thoroughly parboiled, actually enjoyed it. He had little else to do during his imprisonment but cook, think, and sleep. He dwelled on books he had read and wished, as selfish as it was, that he had a companion in his misery. His biggest concern was that he had no fire. It was during this time of forced rest that it occurred to Truman that he should erect some sort of monument, which might, at some future day, inform a casual visitor of the circumstances under which he had perished. At that moment, a gleam of sunshine lit up the lake, and with it the thought flashed upon his mind that he could, with the lens from his opera glasses, get fire from heaven. Truman took out his opera glasses and felt like he had just received a gift, as smoke curled from the bit of dry wood in his hand. After the storm broke, Truman had to stay at the hot springs a bit longer as he recovered from an accident. While asleep, he had broken the crust on which he lay, and the hot steam poured out onto his hip and scalded him severely before he could escape. Truman had somehow lost both knives since getting lost, but now fashioned his belkel into a knife and created shoes out of bark. He mended his clothes the best he could and made a fish line. After 8 days at the hot springs, he set off once more to find his companions, with a bag full of thistleroot. Truman was constantly traveling in dreamland as he traveled through the rough terrain. At first, he tried to shake off the feelings, but soon decided that it was better to live in a world of ideal happiness and in a world of positive suffering at the same time. The sun disappeared, and with it the warmth. Days merged, and still Truman trudged on, a skeleton of the man he had been. His inflamed hip made it so he had to sleep upright, and then, to add to his pain, he fell into the fire and burned his hand. Truman went through fits of despair and then wonder. At one point, he stopped and stared at the 3 peaks of the Tetons, a mere 50 miles away. To his right, the Madison Range was picturesque, despite being scarred with ravines, gorges, and canyons. He described the panorama that spread around him as that of grotesque ridges and miniature lakes, which steamed with hot springs. Truman had to shake himself back to reality, which consisted of lacerated and festering feet and the need for firewood. While wandering the beach of a lake for driftwood, Truman managed to lose a slipper and spent hours before he found his lost treasure. That night, he said the crashing waves were a wild lullaby. The next morning, refreshed, and with both his slippers, he was determined to set out for the Madison Mountains if he could not find his companion soon. At noon, Truman found the camp that was last occupied by his friends on this lake, but he only found a dinner fork, which proved invaluable for digging up roots, and a yeast powder can, which became his drinking cup and dinner pot. Later, Truman discovered that they had hidden food for him that he had never found. He left the camp in deep dejection, with the purpose of following the trail of the party to the Madison. That night, Truman woke up to the sound of snapping and cracking of burning foliage. His shelter and the adjacent forest were a broad sheet of flame. His left hand was badly burned, and his hair singed closer than a barber would have trimmed it, but Truman was still able to escape from the semicircle of burning trees. He lost his buckle-tongue knife, thin fish hook, and taped fish line to the fire, but didn't have time to think of this loss. As the sheet of fire gobbled up the land, Truman was transfixed by the sight of the burning forest. The roaring, cracking, crashing, and snapping of falling limbs and burning foliage was deafening. Driven by the gale, the fire spread with lightning swiftness over the country, filling the atmosphere with driving clouds of suffocating fumes and leaving a broad and blackened trail smoking and burning to mark the immense sweep of its devastation. When daylight came, Truman turned from the burned land and headed towards the lowest notch in the Madison Range. He struggled over jagged and broken land. When he finally reached the base 2 days later, he did not find the friendly gully or canyon he expected. Helpless despair seized Truman that the journey had been in vain as he stared up at the sheer rock. He had convinced himself that his friends would only be 50 miles away, but the mountain was in his way, and he had run out of thistle. Truman decided to look for a pass before heading back to the Yellowstone River. It was then that the first of his ghostly companions appeared. Truman later insisted that the strange hallucinations which many of his friends have misnamed insanity was to him providence. An old clerical friend, whose counsel Truman held in high regard, appeared to be standing before him. With firm authority, the cleric's voice boomed out.
Go back immediately, as rapidly as your strength will permit. There is no food here, and the idea of scaling these rocks is just pure madness.
Truman instantly protested that the distance was too great and he would not live to travel it.
Say not so. Your life depends upon the effort. Return at once and start now. Least your resolutions will falter. Travel as fast and as far as possible. It is your only chance.
Again, Truman argued against the advice. He told his friend that he doubted the wisdom of his counsel. He was within 70 miles of Virginia, which was just over these rocks. Truman's shoes were worn out, his clothing in tatters, and his strength nearly gone. He felt the only way to survive was to attempt to scale the mountain or perish in the effort.
Don't think of it. Your power of endurance will carry you through. I will accompany you. Put your trust in heaven. Help yourself and God will help you.
Overcome by these and other persuasions, Truman was won over with the idea of having a traveling companion. He plodded his way over the route he had just come. Whenever Truman questioned the wisdom of this route, his old friend appeared to be near with words of encouragement. However, Truman was surprised and annoyed when his friend would not talk on other subjects. It took 4 days of plotting for Truman to find thistles to eat, and he had nearly abandoned all hope of rescue. Once, while struggling through a field of tangled trunks, Truman paused and seriously considered whether it was not preferable to die there than renew the effort to proceed. He then heard a whisper in the air.
"While there is life, there is hope. Take courage."
The voice broke the delusion, and Truman clambered on. He found the tip of a gull's wing that was fresh and made a fire upon the spot. He mashed the bones with a stone and made half a pint of delicious broth. The remainder of that day and the night were given to sleep. Truman lost all sense of time. Days and nights came and went, and were numbered only by the growing consciousness that he was gradually starving. The gaping sores on his feet, the severe burn on his hip, the festering crevices at the joints of his fingers, all terrible in appearance, had ceased to give him the least concern. He dreamt of better times, and then would awake from these feasts to find himself still in Yellowstone. Starving, footsore, half-blind, worn to a skeleton, Truman longed for death, but then he would think of his daughter and felt bound to life. He wanted to spend just one more hour with her and pressed on. At many of the streams on his route, he spent hours trying to catch trout with a hook fashioned from the rim of his broken spectacles, but it never found success. The country was full of game and great variety, but he had no means of killing them, their presence a perpetual aggravation. Storms, wild predators, and hunger were constant companions. Truman relied on the lens of his opera glass for survival, and for one terrifying day had lost the precious lifeline before finding it on the previous night's camp. A solemn conviction took hold of Truman that death was near, and he knew he had done all that one man could do. In 2 or 3 days more, he would be delivered to heaven, and his remains would be found by his friends. He then heard a whispered command.
"Struggle on."
Groping along the side of a hill, Truman became suddenly sensible of a sharp reflection, as of burnished steel. Looking up through half-closed eyes, 2 rough but kindly faces met his gaze. After 37 days of being lost in Yellowstone, and his only companions being ghosts, Truman was saved. On the very brink of the river which divided the known from the unknown, strong arms snatched Truman from the final plunge to death, and kind ministrations wooed him back to life. Baronet and Pritchett, his 2 preservers, were mountain men who had been searching for Truman's body. They brought him to a cabin, and Baronet went off for help. Truman was so ill and skeletal that Pritchett became convinced that the tax assessor would soon die from his ordeal. The night after his arrival at the cabin, while suffering the most excruciating agony and thinking that he had only been saved to die among friends, a loud knock was heard at the cabin door. An old man in mountain costume entered, a hunter whose life was spent among the mountains. He was on his way to find a brother. He listened to the story of Truman's sufferings, and tears rapidly coursed each other down his rough, weather-beaten face. But when he was told of Truman's present necessity, he brightened.
"Why, Lord bless you, your dad is all. I have the very remedy you need. In 2 hours' time, all shall be well with you."
He left the cabin, returning in a moment with a sack filled with the fat of a bear which he had killed a few hours before. From this, he rendered out a pint measure of oil. Truman drank the remedy. By the next day, Truman was freed from pain and his appetite and digestion were reestablished. In a day or two, Truman took leave of his new friends. He made the slow return trip home to Montana and his daughter. A year later, Truman said that the time was not far distant when the wonders of the Yellowstone would be made accessible to all lovers of grandeur. When that time arrived, Truman hoped to revisit the country that nearly claimed his life. To his end days, Truman said that he was rescued by his ghostly companions, and without their advice and encouragement, would have perished in the wilds of Yellowstone. He leaves behind his legacy, Mount Everts and Everts Thistle. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Pioneers of Outlaw Country, Wyoming's history. I hope you enjoyed our trek through the wilds of Yellowstone in 1870. I'm your host, Jackie Dorothy. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, and send in your story request. I'd love to hear from you. Pioneers of Outlaw Country is brought to you by Rooted in Legacy, helping you preserve your family stories and the legends that shape who we are. Contact us at legendrockmedia.com. This was a production of Legend Rock Media.